Hello, friends. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the show where I get to sit down and chat with other writers, hopefully have deep, meaningful conversations about their journey as a writer, why they decided to become a writer, how they're doing as a writer, craft, all that good stuff. And before I get to today's guest, I just want to mention that you should absolutely check out my company, unboundwriter.com. That's unboundwriter.com, where we offer coaching and writing retreats, one-on-one coaching with me, as well as online classes. Our first 3 online classes are listed right now at unboundwriter.com, and they're great. They're go at your own pace. You purchase the course, and then you can just take the course in whatever order you want, and take as long as you want to take it. And there's a great one on there that I did called Writing Thrillers. So if you're particularly interested in thriller writing, I think you'll find a lot of good information in there. Unboundwriter.com. Today's guest. So, I get a lot of different guests on the show. Obviously, most of them exist within my writing purview of mystery, thriller, suspense, but not limited to that. I've had writers of all different backgrounds on, and not too infrequently, I talk to a nonfiction writer, a predominantly nonfiction writer, and that was the conversation I had today with Gina DeMillo Wagner. So Gina got connected to me through a mutual publicist of ours. And coincidentally, Gina lives in the very same small town of Erie, Colorado, that I live in. So we are about 10 minutes from one another, and we have never crossed paths, but I was really excited to get to talk to her. Hopefully we didn't get too local in our conversation. But Gina is very intriguing. She currently has a book out now called Forces of Nature, a memoir of family, loss, and finding home, which we went into much more detail about this book than I normally talk to a guest about for any particular work of theirs. But the book kind of centers on, growing up with a sibling who had a rare genetic disorder that caused him to veer from loving to violent. He died suddenly, and it's kind of Gina's reflections of that. So it's very intriguing, and it also includes an investigation into his cause of death. And as she noted in her comments here, that wasn't, she doesn't want to call it true crime because it's not a sensationalist kind of thing, but there were some unanswered questions that she had. And this memoir helped her to explore, if not necessarily answer those questions. But she started out, as a journalist working within the industry through magazines and newspapers, and kind of cut her teeth on a lot of short form writing, but obviously expanded into long form until she became inspired to write this memoir, which she had a really good comment about it, kind of saying, this was the book that she needed to write to allow her to write more books, that this would have been the book that would have been the regret had she not written, while as she's on her deathbed. She's very grateful and proud, I think, and happy that she was able to write this book. And obviously it's very personal to her as well. So we explored that a lot. And then we had a wonderful little making it up session that dealt with monkeys. So I think you're going to enjoy that. This is a good one, folks. You're going to like this one. This is my conversation with Gina DeMillo Wagner. So our paths have never crossed, I'm guessing.
Yeah, but we're neighbors, right?
And that's why I was just, this sounds weird, but I book guests and then I kind of forget. And then I go back in like an hour before, I'm like, who am I talking to? And I look at my notes that I created when I initially made the booking. And usually that's months before. And it said, oh, she's a neighbor. I'm like, she's a neighbor. Yeah. So you're here in Erie?
I am, right closer to Lafayette, but yes.
Okay. How long have you lived in Erie for?
Well, we lived here and then we moved away and then we moved back. So we took a little detour to Phoenix, Arizona for my partner's job and then came back. So this time we've been back for 7 years.
Okay, right on. And just for the listeners, so Erie, Colorado is a suburb of both Boulder and Denver, more so Boulder. In my mind, it's a tiny little town, but it's not a tiny little town. It used
It
to be a
used to
tiny.
be.
So I lived in Lafayette in the late '90s, and I moved here. We built a house back in 2002, and I'm up in Erie Village, where all the Victorian homes and stuff like
Yep.
that. And so I've been in the same house since 2002, and it was little, it was little back then. And so, the writing community is obviously not huge as far as I know. So it's always nice to meet another writer from the actual same town. And
Absolutely.
um, who do you know who connected us together on this?
Julia, my publicist.
And is right. And is Julia actually, she's not related to you, right?
No, but I think her sister also lives in
Right.
Erie.
Yeah, because I remember Julia came out here once and I had coffee with her because I've been with Kay for, I think, 6 books now, maybe something like that. I forget how many. So I've gotten to know her pretty well. But yeah, it's small world is the point I'm trying to make.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So where did you grow up? Not in Colorado, somewhere else?
No, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and
Okay.
then stayed in the Southeast for college and grad school, and then ended up in Eastern Pennsylvania working for a publishing company there. So I started out as a journalist working for different outdoor and travel magazines. And
Okay.
then that brought me to Boulder. There was a travel magazine that I worked for here that doesn't exist anymore. But yeah, that's what moved me out here. And honestly, this has felt more like home than anywhere else I've ever lived.
Yeah, I agree. I've been here since '96. I will say, like my partner and I talk about, moving every now and then. Once my kids are in college and hers is a couple years away, just I do feel like it's a little bit like anywhere else, more crowded, more less pleasant to drive around.
Yeah,
And I'm like, where can we? I'm like, I don't want to become a recluse necessarily, but recluser.
right. Yeah, it's tricky. And I think it feels crowded to those of us who lived here for a while. When we lived here the first time, it was like 2003 to 2010, and then we came back in 2017 and it felt like, oh my gosh, it's a
Yeah,
completely different place. It's so crowded.
yeah,
But yeah, every time I have that conversation, I think about like, well, but we have access to all the great restaurants and culture and concerts and
yeah.
so there's a little bit of not wanting to leave that behind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and just airlift, even things like that. Like it's so easy to fly anywhere, but yeah. But so you obviously have had writing in your bloodstream for a long, long time. So talk to me a little bit about that. When you were a kid, were you exhibiting signs that you wanted to be a writer?
Yes, I was. I mean, I'm kind of that cliche, when you come from a dysfunctional childhood, you're kind of destined to become a writer and write
Yeah,
about it. So
right.
I was writing from a very young age as a way to kind of feel seen and witness the experiences I was having. I grew up in a family with a sibling who had some severe disabilities. So
Which is the
um,
focus of your memoir.
which is the focus of my memoir. Yeah. So I grew up kind of caretaking everyone else, and writing was an outlet, when I was a kid. I think it was a way to just kind of validate what I was experiencing and be a witness to myself. But I really didn't consider it a viable career.
Does anyone ever?
I know. Is it? Still working on it. When I grow up, I'm going to be.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, I actually went to college to study wildlife biology first. And
Okay.
my idea was like, oh, I want to be outdoors. I want to save endangered species. And writing was a hobby. So I minored in creative writing as an
Mhm.
undergraduate and just was writing because I still enjoyed it. And then I had a couple of professors in the wildlife biology program who were like looking at my scientific term papers, and they're like, this is actually really good. And there's a need for people who can write about science and the outdoors and things that are, important, kind of translate all of that for a general audience. So that's when I went back and got my master's in journalism and started pursuing writing full time and editing.
I mean, and that must have like sparked something in you, because it's not a throwaway comment, but it's, that one conversation or maybe a couple conversations about that, all of a sudden you're on a full new trajectory in your life. So there must have been something in you that says, yeah, that actually sounds really interesting, more so than maybe some of the other options that you would have had through those degrees. Kind of, if had you say it was a hobby, but must have been something that you were probably eager to pursue a little bit more.
Yeah, it felt like if it could be a way of life and if it could be something that I offer to other people as a service, so it's not just something that I'm doing quietly on my own, but if this is something where I can tell stories and, you know, get information out there to people that's useful in a way that's engaging, then it felt really meaningful in terms of just trying to like put more energy towards it. And then I was working as an editor too for different magazines. So I kind of got to see both sides of it, like you know, how do you create a magazine or a newspaper, and how do you interrogate, these different topics and fact check and dig in. The analytical brain was still active too, in terms of
Right,
doing research.
right. And also I would assume through your various publications, learning not only short form, but long form journalism, where you can like have a 10,000 word piece that really gets into a subject versus maybe what you would typically associate with a magazine article. And those are, I'm always impressed. I've talked to a lot of writers who were first journalists or also journalists, but that's where they cut their teeth, and learning kind of how to get to the point, how to be pithy, how to make it relatable, in less than 1,000 words is tremendously difficult. I don't think people understand. They think less writing is easier, and it's
Right.
to me, it's not. Like when I do a short story, I'm like, I have so much to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Those, I used to, we used to have these like 400 word pieces at the beginning of the magazine, and those were the hardest to write.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
the economy of words.
Right. But it's such a talent to have that. And, I'm a firm believer in it all comes alive in the editing. I finish a book and I've barely even looked back at what I've written. I haven't outlined. It's just a fucking mess. And the main thing that I do when I'm editing is I'm cutting. Almost more than anything else, I'm cutting, because, I'm changing things obviously, but I'm like, all right, this isn't serving the story. It's a great sentence, but if I'm being honest with myself, it's not serving the story. And that takes a long, it's not even just a talent. It just takes a long time to get an eye for that. And with schooling and with that experience with magazines, I assume you learned that relatively quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I started out before magazines. When I was getting my master's, I was working in different daily newspaper newsrooms. And honestly, that was the best training, because when you have a deadline every single day and they
Right.
measure everything in inches, not words, I mean, that was
Right.
back when
Column
like they
inches.
actually, yeah, could have column inches. And you're just literally, you know, with 10 minutes until it has to go to the printer, trying to tap out something that's accurate and compelling and, kind of pulls in everything. That
Yeah.
was the real trial by fire. And then magazines are a little bit more spacious, at least in terms of the deadlines. I was working for a monthly magazine, so it wasn't quite as intense. But
Yeah.
yeah, and then, honestly, all of that served me really well when it came time to write the memoir, because what I realized is, a memoir is so much more than your personal story. It has to be in service to the reader as well as, capturing your own unique experience. And so having that foundation and trying to think about, okay, how is this story completely unique? How is it compelling, but how is it also everyone's story? Like, where are those points of connection
Right.
and resonance so that I can turn this into a book that is not just about me, but is really about everyone?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point, because memoirs are interesting. I love reading memoirs. And I know you also, I think you teach also at Lighthouse. So I'm sure you come across students with memoir ideas, memoir partials, and you're 100% right in what you're saying, because the knee-jerk reaction to thinking about a memoir is that it's very kind of egocentric in a way, that I want to tell my story. This is what happened to me. And you start to look at these ideas and you're like, or you realize like, all right, a lot of people have had a lot of trauma in their lives and they want to write about it. And the harsh reality is that doesn't mean it's going to be interesting to others, right? It still has to be a story that other people want to read. And you as the writer are not always the best judge of that, especially when it's so personal like that. Did you, as you were sitting down to write Forces of Nature, were you sitting thinking like, all right, do I want to write this for myself first of all, then maybe it's a memoir? Or were you thinking first off, like, I want to write a book and I want to sell this book?
I wasn't thinking that first. I definitely was doing what I have always done, which is try to make meaning of the events of my life through writing. So that's what I started out doing is, how do I make sense of all the things that have happened? I think there's also a misconception that writing a memoir is the thing that heals you from all your trauma. And I disagree with that. I think a lot of the healing, a lot of the work has to happen off the page, whether that's therapy or your own personal self-reflection or whatever you do to heal from the things that have happened to you. And then once you come to the page, you're just giving shape to the story. For me, it was like almost like solving a puzzle through writing. And then I didn't really consider it a book until I wrote an essay for the New York Times where I just was like, okay, I want to offer this to people. Like my experience growing up alongside somebody with a severe disability is something that I haven't seen. Like I wanted to write the thing that I wish I had had to read when I was going through everything. And so I started out writing an essay for the New York Times called Mourning the Loss of a Sibling Rival, and just talked about kind of the ambivalent feelings that come along with losing somebody suddenly who you had a complicated relationship with, growing up alongside somebody who always needs more, muting your own needs. There's this whole experience out there that millions of people have that isn't really talked about. And so I published that essay thinking I was offering something to other siblings like me. And what happened was the comments and the emails and all the feedback that I got came from all sorts of people who grew up in complicated families. It was, people who grew up with addiction in their family or mental illness or some sort of high medical need. There was just a lot of situations where people grew up feeling invisible, and maybe they lost somebody suddenly and they're trying to figure out what did we mean to each other. So that was when I was like, okay, I actually think that there's a bigger story here and that it can speak, to a much bigger audience than what I previously thought.
Yeah, because and this is just a guess of mine, but I'm guessing you and all these people who wrote to you about this, I assume there's some kind of almost guilt associated with writing it from a perspective of the sibling who didn't have the mental illness, the sibling who felt that they didn't get as much attention, but then like, well, who am I to, like, for the grace of God go I, that I didn't have this, and now who am I to like say that, this was tough for me too. Is that true? Was there some kind of guilt associated with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts of guilt. There's survivor's guilt, which is what you're describing. I'm the able-bodied sibling. I'm the lucky one. I put that in quotations. That's something that I heard a lot as a kid, like, oh, you're so lucky, to be able-bodied, but you're so lucky to have a brother like the brother that you had. And yes, that's true. But I think when people are too quick to silver line it or to be great, jump to gratitude, like I can't talk about this because I'm so lucky, then you are denying this whole other side of the experience that's also very true and very valid. And so what I wanted to do was kind of make room for all of it, just like let's allow the full spectrum of this experience that a lot of people have, and name it. And it doesn't, cancel out anything. It's not, if I'm saying that it was a challenging experience, it doesn't cancel out the joy and the love and all the other positive things that came from it too.
Right. But most people who are saying you're lucky don't want to have that conversation. They're not looking to like jump into kind of a deeper discussion about it. They're just trying to say something that like makes them feel okay about it, which is, I
Yeah.
mean, we're all guilty of that. So I definitely get that. So I'm, so let's back up a little bit. So you're working as a professional writer, and obviously you're getting published by places like the New York Times. And in that case, is that kind of like you're on their radar and you're able to give them a pitch, and they say yes or no kind of a thing? Is that how that works?
Yeah, that one was a cold pitch. The New York Times with essays, personal essays, a lot of times they want to see the draft, op-eds, I think you can actually pitch an idea, but I just drafted something and I looked up who the editor was. It was for the a column that I don't know if it exists anymore. It's called Ties. It's all about family, different kinds of family ties that you have, and it's in their well section.
Yeah.
And it was just a cold pitch. I sent it over and was really shocked when I got a response within a couple weeks. I felt like it, I've been writing for publications for many, many years, and to hear back quickly is not something that.
To hear back at all is pretty
Yeah,
impressive.
exactly. Yeah. So yeah, they got back to me within a couple weeks that they wanted to run it, and worked with their team to edit it and fact check and all that. So
That's great. And that's a great resume builder. Now, as you're working as a professional writer, and I'm, thinking about, okay, if I can even define it, what does a career path look like for somebody who wants to write full time? And it's pretty indefinable, right? Because there's a lot of different ways that you can do it, most of which don't work. If you're talking about actually supporting yourself, were you thinking about, okay, I want to do this for a few years and then I want to try writing novels, or I want to do a memoir, or maybe I'll go write for TV? Or did you have a plan?
I was
Do
working
you
full
have a plan
time.
now?
Do I have a plan? I don't know. But like a lot of writers, I was working full time in another job entirely while I was writing this book. So
Got it.
my career path was I did work full time for different magazines for many years. And then the last outdoor magazine that I worked for during the recession went under, and that's when I started freelancing. But eventually I actually found my way back to a corporate 9 to 5 job.
Yeah.
Um, and was writing kind of in the margins of that, and I've got
Right.
a couple of teenagers. So, I felt like I was grabbing every 15-minute block of time that I could.
That's what it is.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think what you said a minute ago is so true. Like there's no one template for how to do this. And right now what my writing life looks like, I'm no longer in a corporate job full time, but I consult, I write content for different organizations. I kind of structure my time so that I have, a certain number of hours a week where I'm working on, the next book proposal or essays, and then a certain amount of like billable hours that I'm giving to other organizations and creating content for them.
Yeah. Well, and also the landscape for the professional writer is constantly shifting. I mean, you alluded to the fact that the magazine went out of business during the recession. It doesn't even take a recession now. It's magazines and newspapers are falling by the wayside left and right. Professional bloggers are getting more and more, I think better at their jobs. There's some amazing bloggers out there, but to sustain a lifestyle based on that is incredibly difficult. Writing books, it's a total crapshoot. I mean, if you're lucky to be published at all, if you're one of the 1% who have an agent
Right.
and get published, then to actually make money, sustainable money on it is really difficult. So you got to end up doing it just because like you love it, and you got to figure your shit out. Otherwise, I was like you, I was full-time job, and I would write an hour a day, and now I don't have that full-time job, but I still only write an hour a day because that's what I know. But if you do it
Yeah.
enough, you can get a book done, for me at least, in 8 to 9 months.
Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't mean you're going to make a lot of money off of it. So it's tough. It's
Yeah.
tough.
It's
Um,
this industry is so much about persistence. I mean, you have to have some talent, but you also have to have a lot of patience and a lot of persistence.
right. And that talent, I think that talent gets refined because of the persistence, and the consistency. I mean, One of the things I coach is just write every day. Yeah, I don't care if it's 15 minutes, but you're building that muscle over time. And if you do it every single day, not only will you get better, you'll find out if you really want to be a writer. Because if you're the person who's like, I like to work out a lot, or you think you do, and then every time you go to the gym, you're like, I really am not into this. And if that happens to you when you're a writer, you're not a writer.
Right.
You've got to really love it. And because a lot of the days suck, a lot of the days are tough, and the ideas don't come, or the writing is subpar. And so you can't overcome that unless you just have this deeply rooted passion for it, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
So walk me through the process a little bit of, well, first of all, writing the memoir, and Forces of Nature, which is about your relationship with your brother, what happened to your brother, and kind of, I think and it's a little bit of a mystery too, right? Which I think is compelling. As you're writing, and you had written a lot about it, it sounds like, at least maybe through journaling or whatever over the years, did you go back and read through your old journals, take some of that? And then how did you figure out when you were done?
Yeah. It's interesting in terms, I can answer the done part first, because I had a really unusual experience in talking with other authors. I feel like this is probably unusual, but I knew where the end of the book was before I started it. Like I knew I could visualize two arcs, which, if you've read the book, there's two narrative arcs. There's, it starts, and this is not a spoiler, it starts with the moment that I found out that my brother died suddenly, and the aftermath of that. And then, the parallel arc is kind of what happened to us in childhood. And there were things that were happening in the present day arc. There were questions that I had that could only be answered by the childhood arc. So in terms of the structure and the beginning and the end, that was pretty clear to me from the beginning. And then in terms of just the writing process, I really approached it as a journalist. Like the thing with memoir is it's obviously the truth of the author's experience. And I kind of think about it in terms of, if you have a prism and you hold it up to the light and you turn it a certain way, it's gonna reflect things a little bit differently. So, my experience and my perspective is going to be different than other family members or other people that were there.
Right.
But I knew that there was a lot of verifiable information and facts that I wanted to get right as I was writing it. So I was looking at old journals. I went and pulled a lot of public documents from my childhood and high school. I was pulling my brother's medical records. I was interviewing people. I actually set up interviews with as many people as possible from those events in my childhood to kind of get their perspective. And
does that include family members?
Yeah, it included family members. It included childhood friends that I'm still friends with today. It included some of my parents' friends who I think could shed some light on things. So as much as I could verify, I verified. And, and then the rest is a creative writing process like any other, a narrative nonfiction book, where you're trying to offer all the visceral details and the setting, and you're trying to bring everything into 3 dimensions for the reader. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything. It's a little bit of journalism, a little bit of creative writing.
Yeah. And there's a lot of emotion, I would assume, and also consider what amazes, what I love about writing fiction is I get to say whatever I want, and whether you like it or not, it's how my brain is working at the time, whatever. If I'm thinking about writing something about a personal history, I immediately in my mind start thinking about, okay, who's going to read this? Are they going to have a problem with it? What does it say about me? I mean, even my dumb newsletter, sometimes I'll want to say something. I'm like, oh, that's going to annoy my mom if I tell that story, and some little trite story. I can't imagine, there must be, as you're going through the editorial stages of this, of this is an important piece of information, but I feel in my gut that so-and-so is going to be really upset. Did you have to go through that?
I think one of your jobs as a memoir writer is to kind of set up guardrails to define where your experience ends and someone else's begins.
Right.
So I kind of had that in mind as I was writing it. Like I didn't want to creep too far into someone else's perspective. And that's different for different people. For me, it's a really subjective measure. It was more of a gut feeling that I had where I'm like, I think I'm actually getting a little too far into someone else's perspective. But then beyond that, I think the only way for me to write the book was to kind of quiet that voice that said, oh, better not
Which
say
is not
that.
easy to do.
It's not easy to do, but it also mirrored the experience that I had growing up. Like it goes back to what you were
Mhm.
saying a few minutes ago, where you're not allowed to say that this is a hard thing that I went through. As a kid, I wasn't allowed to speak up. I wasn't allowed to tell people what was happening at home. So there was a little bit of liberation in saying, okay, actually, I'm going to go ahead and tell the story as it was for me. I'm going to quiet those voices. Obviously, the whole book goes through a legal and fact checking process. So um, I felt like I wasn't alone in making some of those decisions. But ultimately, I think like if you are too worried when it comes to memoir and personal essay, if you're too worried about who's going to read it, it restricts your ability to write the story. I would say
Of
go ahead and
course.
write it first,
Yeah.
and then if you need to like dial some things back, you can do that later.
And then what was the process like? So did you have to go through the process of finding an agent and then they shop it, all that stuff?
Yeah, I found an agent kind of halfway through the book. Actually, I teach at Lighthouse now, but I'm a Lighthouse success story because I started out in one of their advanced workshops
Hmm.
about 5 or 6 years ago. So I was workshopping the first 20 pages of what became the memoir in one of those workshops, and my workshop instructor um, was really moved by my pages and
Hmm.
helped connect me with a couple different agencies. And I found my agent that way. Um, so then I was able to kind of finish, you talk about how there's a little bit of like an investigation, a little bit of I don't want to say true crime because that sounds kind of sensational, but I had some questions about what happened to my
Of
brother. And
course.
so kind of shaping that part of the story and finding a satisfying ending place, my agent and I were able to work on that together. And then we also wrote a book proposal. So that was like another process of,
Right.
identifying the market and the audience and all the things that go into that. By the time we were ready to submit, she was ready to submit to publishers. It was March 2020. And
Oh,
so it became a little bit tricky. We just kept
right.
trying to find with everything that was going on with COVID and then all the social injustices happening in the world. We just kept trying to like, she would submit it and then pull it back and submit it again. We were just trying to
Right.
find that opening for a memoir amidst all the noise that
Right.
was happening.
Yeah,
Uh,
and just for the listener, a couple things. One, with nonfiction and memoirs, et cetera, you typically write a proposal, which to your point, Gina, is talking about here's the idea for the book, but here's the market, here's the audience, which is hard to research and hard to understand. But you don't have to have the book written. With fiction, you send them, you don't send them the book, but you have to have had the book written, and then if they're interested, they'll ask for it. So it's it's more work, really, writing the memoir because you have to write the nonfiction proposal, um, and the shopping of it during COVID for the listener. Once you send something out, once your agent sends something out to a publisher, that's your shot with that publisher. So if they say no, you're not going back to them a year later with the same memoir. So in tumultuous times when everyone's not only scared and distracted, but also unsure if anyone's going to be reading anymore, you don't have a fair shot at shopping this. So I'm sure your agent was being very mindful of like, okay, I think this person might be our best shot, but I don't want to send this right now because if they're distracted and they don't want it, then we blew our shot. And so I'm sure
right.
you were going through all of that at the time.
Yeah, you want to hit the right tone. You want to be sensitive. I mean, especially like early 2020 or, spring of 2020, a lot of the editors that my agent would be sending it to were suddenly working remotely. So it's like, how are they even making those decisions about what books to buy when they're not in the conference rooms talking about them? And does
Right.
that change the way you pitch to a publisher when, you're pitching to somebody at their home office versus somebody who's in a more collaborative environment? So
Right.
yeah, it was tricky.
And not even just collaborative, which is kind of actually one of the unfortunate things sometimes about publishing is it can be killed by one committee member. Every 9 people love it, one person does it and doesn't, and that's it. But also, like, these editors who are working at home, just like everybody else, they're not as focused, and they're being tasked with reading manuscript after manuscript. I mean, I can never wrap my head around. I talk to my editor. I'm like, I don't know how you. It takes me forever to read a book. And you've got kids screaming in the background trying to learn from home, and you're trying to read this, and your book isn't getting the fair. But that's just the nature of the industry at that time. But it sold.
It did.
So how
Yeah,
long did that
yeah.
take?
It took a while.
Yeah.
It, yeah, we like paused submissions and then we would restart. And so, eventually, like, honestly, like, I don't know how my agent felt, but I was at the point where I was like, I think we maybe need to give up on this. And right at that moment, it was fall of 2022.
Mm,
We got 2 offers within a couple days from smaller presses.
that's
So
crazy.
yeah, it was wild. It was
That is
wild.
that's amazing. That's such a that getting that book sold is there's nothing like it, because most of life for a writer is rejection. And we've all been through tons and tons and tons of rejection, or at least I have.
Yeah.
And to
Yeah.
finally sell something and then to sell multiple things, yeah, and then you can go back to rejection very easily.
Yeah.
Um, nothing. I have something on submission right now. I'm like, I have no idea if they're going to want this. Like, who knows? I could have just wasted 9 months of my life. Well, not wasted, but it might not sell. I have no
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
But again,
There's a
that goes
lot of
back to,
different. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it goes back to you do it because you love it. And if you focus on the love, good things will happen. If you just sit there and wait for good things to happen, they probably won't.
Yeah, you do have to keep persisting. You have to have a high tolerance for rejection. Having worked as a magazine editor, I think helped me in that because I was the one, when I was an editor, freelancers were pitching stories to me at the magazines I worked at, and I got to see that side of things, and I got to understand that it's rarely ever personal, and a lot of times it has nothing to do with the quality of the writing. Like, a lot of times I would maybe get 5 pitches where they were all so similar and I just had to pick one, or I had to reject something because we've already done something on that topic or it conflicts with something else. So
Right.
for me, it's been helpful to just kind of remind myself that it's not personal, and there's so many factors that we can't even imagine that go into those decisions.
Right. But understanding that is a huge step for any writer, like teaching somebody what you can control and what you can't control, because most of the publishing industry is something a writer has zero control over. And a very common story is editorial rejections that praise the writing, and that's not bullshit praise. If it's going to a
Right.
high profile editor, they're going to be honest with you whether they like the writing or not. And a lot of times it's like, this isn't what we're looking for right now, and you can't control that. And that's a great learning experience of knowing, like, okay, I'm a good writer. This wasn't, because it does have to hit that one person at the right time perfectly, and you really can't control that. But you can learn from that rejection. I mean, my first 3 books didn't sell, and I would go back and read the editorial rejections and, like, okay, what's the common thread? What
Yeah.
am I doing wrong? And that's not an easy thing to do, but you have to, because that's the nature of the industry, I think.
Yeah. Or, I mean, it might have nothing to do with the writing. It could be what the market is doing. You know what I mean? Like,
Totally.
think about all the vampire books that came out for a while, and then suddenly
Right.
we're done with vampires, and
Right.
you might have a brilliant book about vampires, but it's not going to sell because the market's done with it for now.
Right, which is why you never want to chase the market either, it's the greatest folly is for a writer to be like, okay, I mean, that was such a Dan Brownie kind of thing, those types of books after Da Vinci Code. And like you said, like they might have a long window, maybe 8 to 10 years, but then they're going to go away. And what chasing the market ends up doing is you end up writing something it's not as good as it can be because it's probably not what you really want to write, and then you might just miss the market, and then then you're stuck. So I think you write what just comes to you and what you have a deeply rooted like passion and interest in, and hope.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to do it.
For me, selling this book was especially meaningful. Like this felt like the one book that I needed to write so that I can write other things. You know what I mean? This is the one that on my deathbed, if I hadn't found a way to tell this story, I would have really regretted it. So it was really meaningful on a lot of different levels that it found a home.
So now that it's done, it's sold, it's out, are you starting to think like other ideas for long form writing or novels or other memoirs?
Yeah, I've been working on a lot of essays and other kind of narrative nonfiction projects and kind of circling a little bit back to my roots in nature and wildlife biology. I wrote an essay a couple years ago about my experience being an intern taking care of baby sea turtles and kind of tied that into some themes like nurturing and surrogacy and displacement and kind of human experiences, and that ended up winning a prize, and it gave me some inspiration and energy for writing more of that, like looking at the intersections of nature and nurturing and what the outdoors can teach us about ourselves. So I have some projects kind of cooking in that vein. And then, I mean, I think there's potentially another memoir to write, but I think I would do it very differently. Like I'm thinking of some experimental forms that.
Interesting. So, and usually when you sell a book, and I know a memoir is a little bit different because obviously a memoir is very specific. But typically a publisher will say, we love this, we want it, but we also want to know what else do you have? Because a lot of publishers want to develop you as a writer. Some don't, some just want that book. What was your experience? And is your publisher asking, what else do you have?
I think my publisher is definitely open to anything else that I have. I didn't, it's not in the contract that they have first refusal. So I think we would probably go out to a wider group again with the next project. But it's that was more part of the conversation with my agent, and part of the reason why I chose my agent after talking with her is because, she was interested in hearing what else I have and wasn't interested in just selling this book and then parting ways. Like we kind of had some really creative, fun conversations about
That's great.
What if I write something like this? And would you be open to something like that? And so feeling kind of like I've got a partner in that process has been really nice.
Yeah, because the agent's invested into you as well. I mean, when I got an agent with my first book, one of the first 3 that didn't sell. And I remember about 6 months through the rejection process, I furiously wrote a second book because I'm like, my agent's just going to drop me. Like, once this thing that gets fully rejected. And you kind of realize over time that's not necessarily the case at all. It's like they're very picky about who they take on because not only do they not make any money until they sell something, they want to develop you as well. So like, I'm taking you on not for this book. I'm taking you on for your 4th book, kind of a thing. So it's I've been with my agent now 21 years, and it's a relationship. Is your agent here in Colorado or?
No, she's in New York. She's in New York. So, but I mean, I've had friends whose agents have dropped them after that first book didn't sell. So I was worried about that. I wanted what you're describing. I wanted our careers to kind of develop together and for it to feel like a partnership.
Yeah, because the other thing you see, and you've probably heard these stories and evidence them at Lighthouse, is what's even more common is for the writers to drop their agents because they feel like she hasn't sold anything, so I'm going to move on to somebody else. And I'm not saying that's a bad move. I've never done that. You know, I've been with the same agent my whole career. But you start to think of like, okay, the book is the book, and you want an agent who's competent and who knows people and who is, aggressive in the way agents need to be. But is agent A going to sell something that agent B couldn't, sending it to the exact same person? I've never been convinced of that. And I've never seen evidence where somebody jumps agents and then all of a sudden is this like massive success because of the agent, as opposed to like they just wrote something that hit the market a little bit better. But it happens all the time. I'm not sure if you see that at Lighthouse with your students.
Yeah. I mean, I try to remind people that it's a working relationship that could be long-term. It's essentially a business partnership. And I think as an eager writer who wants to publish a book, a lot of times you have this energy where you're like, oh my gosh, are they going to pick me? Are they going to choose me? And I try to remind people that it goes both ways. Like you are also choosing your agent, and it needs to feel like a good fit for you. And you should be asking if you are submitting to agents and you end up on a phone call where you're trying to figure out if you'd be a good fit, you should also as an author be asking questions about, what does your submission process look like? How often do you communicate? How do you like to communicate? Is it email? Is it phone call? Are you willing,
Right.
if a big publisher doesn't pick up this book, are you willing to submit it to smaller publishers? Because
Right.
some agents don't want to do that because it's a risk. I mean, it's a lot of time, and with a smaller publisher, obviously there's not as much money.
Right.
But if they have an eye towards, like you said, like they're looking at your second, third, fourth book, and they kind of see the long-term vision, then yeah, they might be more open to starting small.
Yeah. And usually you have to start small. And because the other side of that is, and the Big Five loves a shiny debut, especially in my world of thrillers and mysteries and suspense. And almost always you can't follow up the next book with what that debut did, even if that debut does well or it meets expectations. And then it's a whole other life cycle that you have to go through. But I think the reality of it is, with getting an agent or with selling a manuscript, that's really hard for an author to feel like they're in any kind of position of power or any kind of position where I've done it once where I've turned down a publisher, and it was it's hard because you're like, who am I to say no to you? And then, then I went on to getting my book rejected by the Big Five within months after that. And I'm like, oh, but then it ended up working out fine. But it's scary. So how am I going to say no when the one agent out of 80 has offered me representation and they're a well-known agent? It's tough, but to your point, you do have some kind of agency with that, but it doesn't feel like that often.
Yeah, it's tough.
So, well, Gina, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do the making it up part of the show. And I always get worried about this part because sometimes I mention it and the person looks at me like I have no idea what you're talking about, even though I've emailed them 3 times to make sure.
Yeah.
And then when they're not expecting it, it's horrible because I'm just like, wait, what do you want me to do?
I know what you're talking about. I didn't prepare, so I'm a little.
No, there's nothing to prepare. That's the whole point. It'll be a complete shit show. But I think it's good for the brain. Okay. So I've chosen 3 books kind of at random from my bookshelves. You're going to choose one of those. We're going to pick a random sentence from a random page. I'm going to read that sentence, and that'll be the first sentence in maybe a 2-minute long short story. So very short, very low pressure. I'll read that sentence, and then you can do whatever you want with it. Just give me the next 1 or 2 sentences of what happens next, in a story format. I'll do a couple sentences, and then when it gets too outrageous, I'll call it a day. I've got... none of these are memoirs. I've got Harlan Coben's 6 Years, and then I've got a couple 2024 releases that I haven't read yet. Deborah Ledford's Havoc, so I have no idea what these books are about. And R.G. Belsky's Broadcast Blues. So choose one of those.
Let's try Broadcast Blues. That sounds
All right. Give me a page between 1 and 330.
Let's do 115.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly scan page 115. It's the beginning of a chapter. Let's see. So they're talking about he works in a TV production studio. Okay, I'm going to read this, and you can do whatever you want with it.
Okay.
I remember one station had a reporter working as a dominatrix for a day in a BDSM dungeon.
She brought her monkey with her to work on a leash.
Turned out the ratings for that episode surpassed everything we had ever known, even election coverage from the previous cycle. Who knew BDSM would have spoken so strongly to our Spokane audience?
Because, as it turned out, having a primate at your side was the perfect way to get interview subjects to reveal all of their secrets.
So it was that background that I decided, in order to advance my career, I needed a primate. The only thing was I didn't know how to acquire one.
So, like any good journalist, I went to the library and looked up local regulations for exotic animals. And that's when I discovered Judy, who lived just down the road from me.
Judy agreed to talk to me, and when I showed up to her house, I didn't think she was going to answer the door. But after patiently waiting for at least 3 minutes, the door unlatched, and I heard a fierce screech in the background.
"Don't mind Buster," she said. "He's just hungry for lunch."
I think we call it there. I think Buster probably ends up having a taste for human flesh, is
Right.
where my mind would eventually go with that.
Yeah.
That wasn't so bad.
No. You can, if you can tell, I just watched the chimp documentary on Max recently.
Oh, well, I keep seeing that pop up, so that's good.
It is good. I mean, if you watched Tiger King, it's the same people.
Okay, I didn't watch Tiger King, but I know it was huge. I know.
Like, it's good and disturbing. And
yeah, a little sensational. Yeah, exactly. Perfect kind of TV watching.
Yes.
Well, Gina, we should grab a coffee sometime, since we're eerie neighbors. I write. I still only write 1 hour a day, and I do it now. I'm in the phase of doing it, which I've done for years. In the morning at the Starbucks by the Safeway.
Okay.
So I'm there usually around 7:30 in the morning, 7 days a week. And, they obviously know my order by now, but I write probably 95% of my books in that coffee shop.
Awesome.
So
yeah, I'll keep an eye out for you for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great to connect with you, and I hope I see you around, and thanks for a great conversation today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Take care. All right, that is it. That is my conversation with Gina DeMillo Wagner. You can find out everything about her at her website, which is ginadwagner.com, and you can go buy her new book, Forces of Nature, a memoir of family, loss, and finding home. And please go ahead and check out my website, carterwilson.com, where you can buy my books, subscribe to my newsletter, read my blog, listen to more episodes of this show, and check out my appearances. And then, of course, please go over if you're a writer, an aspiring writer, a struggling writer, an established writer, you can head on over to unboundwriter.com, and there you can check out my offerings for online courses, writing retreats, and one-on-one coaching with me. All right, folks, that is it. That is it for this episode of Making It Up. Thank you, as always, for watching and or listening. Another episode will be out next week. In the meantime, take care.